Russian tanks and troops rolled across the border.
Russia is facing allegations of war crimes.
We're escalating towards World War III.
Here in Ukraine.
All this bloodshed and carnage just came out of nowhere.
What the hell was that?
Putin is a monster. He's unleashed hell in Europe, and the question is why? Why would he do that? Well, if you ask the oldest and wisest man in America, the president, he'll tell you that Putin did it for no reason.
Putin's latest attack on Ukraine was totally unprovoked.
But 25 years ago, this same guy predicted this is exactly what would happen if the US expanded NATO into Eastern Europe.
And if there was ever anything that was going to tip the balance, were it to be tipped in terms of a vigorous and hostile reaction in Russia, it would be that.
So what the hell's NATO? What does this all mean? And what did Biden know 25 years ago that he doesn't know now?
So the best way to get something done, if it holds near and dear to you that you like to be able to, anyway.
Well, to find out what's going on, we got to go way back to the Soviet Union in the 90s, back when Russia and Ukraine were part of the same country. Now, there's a lot of nice stuff in the Soviet Union, like oil, gas, coal, and grandparents that look like this, all of which make it the most resource-rich nation in the world. And now that the US won the Cold War, the Americans had two options. One was to start a new world of equals without war or exploitation, and the other option was to plunder your old rival and make lots and lots of money. Now, if you want to make lots of money in the Soviet Union, the first thing you need is a really, really drunk dude called Boris. He'll do whatever you say, but the problem is, no one likes him. Like, how do you get an unpopular loser like Boris into power? Well, you got to spend money to make money, right? And Boris's friends in the White House slipped him a sneaky $2.5 billion donation, allowing him to monopolize every media outlet and bribe anyone who needed to be bribed. Now, $2.5 billion obviously sounds like a lot of money, but the Americans got a lot more in return. You can do pretty much anything now that Boris is in power. Like, even when 77% of the country votes to keep the USSR together, Boris can ignore that and go get drunk with just 3 dudes. And all he has to do is just open this document. Just open it up. Just concentrate a little bit. Just get it open. Yep. And once it's open, he can sign it and dissolve the Soviet Union himself. And this is where things got really dramatic. It's time for capitalism, baby, which meant selling trillions of dollars worth of Russian assets to private companies. But as they were sold off, all these assets wound up in the weirdest places. I mean, take 26-year-old Boris Jordan, for example, an American who worked for the bank Credit Suisse. This kid ended up owning 10% of the shares in Russia's newly privatized companies. Now, how the hell does a 26-year-old end up buying 10% of the world's biggest country? Well, it turns out this kid was shopping at Crazy Boris's bargain basement. Now, only 10 very special people were allowed to shop here. Just 10 of Boris's American and Russian friends were now the sole owners of the entire Russian economy. Not only did they get it all basically for free, but they were also given a really cool new nickname: oligarch. Now, things were obviously amazing for these 10 dudes, but it wasn't quite as good for the remaining 148,317,990 Russians who woke up in a country that had just sold everything it once had. Food, healthcare, wages, all the vital parts of your life that you took for granted yesterday had suddenly evaporated. Now, Boris conducted what numerous historians have called the greatest theft in world history. Hyperinflation hit 2,323% overnight. Everyone's savings were wiped out in a day. If on Tuesday you had 100 rubles in the bank, on Wednesday you've got 4. It was complete chaos. I mean, poverty grew faster than anywhere in the world at the time. Life expectancy dropped by 10 years, which has never happened to a country in peacetime. I mean, GDP fell by 50%. To put that into perspective, when Hitler invaded Russia in World War II and killed 26 million people, GDP only fell by 24%. This is goddamn crazy. I mean, the Americans and the oligarchs made a killing, and the only thing they had to do to, keep the money flowing was just to keep an eye on Boris and make sure he didn't drunkenly stumble in front of a bus or something. But it wasn't all smooth sailing, right? Soon enough, the democratically elected Russian parliament realized that Boris had created a humanitarian catastrophe, and they barricaded themselves in the building trying to impeach Boris and bring the country back to normal. Now, if you want to resolve this kind of delicate political situation, you need to be subtle, calculated, and above all, very, very careful. Woo! So Boris got his tank and blew up the parliament, massacred a bunch of politicians. He did such a good job that his mate Bill Clinton called him up instantly and congratulated him on his superb handling of the situation. Now, the situation didn't change much for the rest of the 90s. Russia was a poverty-stricken wasteland ruled by murderous gangsters. But in 2000, someone new would show up. I mean, he's still a murderous gangster, sure, but he was killing for different reasons. He was the anti-Boris, and he wanted all of Russia to know that he was a tough guy, he doesn't drink, his nipples look like this, and he's here to discipline the oligarchs and bring the Russian government back in control. And people were into it. I mean, like, freakishly into it. I mean, obviously you have to ignore the repression and poisoning of political opponents, the suppression of independent media, dodgy elections, creeping authoritarianism, but compared to the horrors of the 90s, Putin gave Russians a normal life. Well, normal by Russian standards. But at the end of the day, if it wasn't for the US, a dickhead like Putin would have never needed to exist. And now that Russia was recovering, Putin was getting a bit antsy that the US would be back with a vengeance. Now, once upon a time, there was like a safety buffer between the two powers, with NATO on one side and the Warsaw Pact on the other. Well, I mean, they also touch over on this side, but that doesn't matter. No one cares about a frozen wasteland like Alaska. Now, when the Warsaw Pact disbanded and Germany joined NATO, the Soviets were assured that NATO wouldn't expand further east. But, you know, they did it anyway, because Russia's completely backwards, and what are they going to do about it, right? But everyone from prominent foreign policy experts to senators, military officers, and diplomats, and even the guy who designed America's whole Cold War strategy, they all argued that expanding NATO was a tragic error of historic proportions and that it would start a war in Europe. But that didn't stop them. After years of rampaging around the world, blowing up Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, NATO now had their missiles 400 kilometers from the Russian capital. And watching all this, Putin obviously realized that there are no rules. It was the law of the jungle, baby. And so, like any great jungle standoff, Putin cried and surrendered and tried to join NATO immediately. I mean, they didn't let him join, so Putin was kind of fucked. But the plus side for him was that the average Russian was terrified of NATO expansion. Every time NATO blew up a hospital or a school somewhere, Putin's approval rating went through the roof. But now, across the border in Ukraine and all over Eastern Europe, the 90s were pretty much identical. Everyone got into hard base, they started squatting, and got absolutely ransacked by oligarchs. But the main difference in Ukraine is that they never had a Putin. Ukraine was the land of 100 Borises. Now, the country was split between Russians in the east and Ukrainians in the west, and all they wanted to do was just punch each other in the head and endlessly swap between either pro-Russian or pro-Western oligarchs, making Ukraine the poorest country in Europe. It was an endless cycle. I mean, Yanukovych was a pro-Russian, corrupt asshole who hoarded all the country's mansions, luxury cars, and microphones, I guess. So they had a revolution to kick him out of power and replace him with the pro-Western Yushchenko, who ended up being so corrupt that they kicked him out and went back to Yanukovych, who they kicked out 6 years earlier. But something weird happened in 2014. It was revolution time again, and pro-European protesters came out in Kiev to try and topple Yanukovych. And like any corrupt oligarchic government, he responded with incredible violence. These people are getting brutalized here. Surely there's someone who's strong and brave enough to defend these weak, squishy pro-European protesters and defend them from the police.
Fuck the EU.
See, now this is a leaked phone call between the US Assistant Secretary of State and the US Ambassador to Ukraine, and they're planning out who they should put in charge of the new Ukrainian government.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay.
Now, this phone call was bad news for poor old Klitschko. You know, first he gets beaten up, then the Americans don't even let him in the government.
So, I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
And what do you know? Everyone they decided on in that phone call ended up magically being in charge of Ukraine, with neo-Nazis holding numerous government positions. And the new government didn't waste any time. They got rid of Russian as an official language, started resurrecting all the old Nazi symbols and praising Ukraine's World War II fascist government. Now, if you want to scare the shit out of an ethnic minority, this is how you do it.
The United States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here.
I mean, they were also using Ukraine to make lots and lots of money for their buddies. I mean, like Hunter Biden, right? He's Biden's son and he's also America's best-looking crack addict, with absolutely zero experience, he was given $1 million a year to sit on the board of a Ukrainian gas company. And when Ukraine's top prosecutor started investigating the company for corruption, Biden withheld US aid until they fired the prosecutor.
Look, I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Oh, son of a bitch. Got fired.
Trump did exactly the same thing. Everyone was just taking turns just milking Ukraine, just milking it good. Anyway, Zelensky's approval rating was plummeting, right? And he realized if you can't stop the war, you've got to join the war, right? And he got his opportunity as soon as Biden was elected president. Suddenly, Zelensky did a complete backflip. He went full Putin. He arrested the head of the opposition who had just overtaken him in the polls. He shut down opposition TV channels and most importantly, began talks for NATO membership. Now, Putin was absolutely furious. It used to just be because Putin was shit at piano, while Zelensky could do this. Now, Putin's dick was obviously too small to play piano, so to compensate, Russia starts building up troops on the border and sends out a draft treaty. It said that Ukraine needs to have guaranteed neutrality and that NATO removes its missiles and battle groups from Eastern Europe and Zelensky never plays piano ever again. Now, this standoff lasted for about a year, and the US spent that year doing what you'd imagine someone would do if they wanted Russia to invade Ukraine. First off, they refused to negotiate.
There are some very obvious non-starters in things that the Russians have put on the table.
But simultaneously, the US kept reminding Russia that if they did invade, the US wouldn't do anything about it.
While I will not send American servicemen to fight in Ukraine.
So it became this game of chicken where both sides are flying at each other and Ukraine is just stuck in the middle. And then Russia proved to be the bigger maniac and actually invaded their neighbor. With Russians smashing Ukraine, millions of people fleeing and thousands of civilians dying, a furious Zelensky comes out and reveals that the West was never even going to let him into NATO anyway, but they made him pretend that he was going to.
And the response was very clear. You are not going to be a NATO or EU member, but publicly, the doors will remain open.
The whole thing was a setup, and Zelensky got used in the bloody tug-of-war between East and West. And now thousands of Ukrainians and Russians are dying, and there's a brand new war in Europe. If only there was someone who could have predicted this, someone with the power to stop it.
And if there was ever anything that was going to tip the balance, were it to be tipped in terms of a vigorous and hostile reaction in Russia, it would be that.